Hi, my name's Rebecca Elder, and I'm a preservation consultant based in Austin, Texas. And today we're going to talk about Preservation 101, the preservation environment. Because now we're going to move into actually how do we slow this all down. And the first thing to talk about is the preservation environment. If you only take one thing away from the hour we have together today, this is it. Controlling your storage environment is the absolutely most important thing you can do to care for your collection. It does the most good for the most materials. And what does that mean? So, temperature. High temperatures will accelerate deterioration. And there is a specific formula for that. For every 10 degrees Celsius, which is 18 degrees Fahrenheit, that you raise the temperature, you double the rate of deterioration. It's called the Arrhenius equation. You don't need to know that, but if you want to write it down, it's ARRHENIUS. But it means that if we have two collections and we can store one at 60 degrees and one at 78 degrees, if everything else is the same, the one that's stored at 78 degrees will deteriorate twice as fast as the one that we store at 60 degrees. So even dropping our temperature a couple of degrees will slow things down considerably. So that's the first thing. The second factor is the relative humidity, which is actually what has the greatest effect on our materials, because relative humidity is what provides all of the moisture for those chemical reactions. High relative humidity also creates a suitable environment for mold growth. If you have relative humidity of 65% or more for 72 hours, that's when mold will begin to grow, more or less. So, I don't know. I live in Texas, in central Texas, where it gets really humid. That's 65% relative humidity we laugh in the face of. So we're going to be at risk for mold. But if you're even in a desert environment, if something happens with your heating and air conditioning system, I know of more than one mold outbreak that's taken place in a desert environment with low outdoor relative humidity because the air conditioning has gone nuts. So your relative humidity is, high relative humidity will catalyze mold growth. And also, all of this paper-based material is hygroscopic, which means it expands and contracts in relationship to the amount of moisture in the air. And every time we ask our paper to do that, it stresses it. Low relative humidity, less problematic. It leads to static, which isn't a huge deal for paper, but it also will lead to drying out of your paper-based materials. If we get our relative humidity, drop it down to 10 or 15%, all of a sudden our paper is less flexible because there's less water keeping it moist. At this point, you're probably saying, what does that mean for us? What should we do? And if you ask me for a hard and firm number, this is what it is. There is an ANSI, which is American National Standards Institute, standard that says for mixed use storage, so we have to store our paper and our photos and our film and our magnetic media, and we have to have people in the same space. This is the standard, which is a stable temperature no higher than 70 degrees, stable relative humidity between 30 and 50%, and minimal fluctuations, so like plus or minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit in a 24-hour period, plus or minus 2% relative humidity in that same day. That is really, really difficult to achieve. It is also really, really, really expensive. If you can do it, your building probably can't because it's probably not built to do this. If you're in a historic house, this is never going to happen for you. But luckily, we are changing our views of the preservation environment. And now we're not just saying, okay, everything has to be 68 to 70, 35 to 50% relative humidity, and then leaving it to you all to figure out how you're going to make your HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment do that. Really what we're concerned about is the temperature and the amount of moisture in the air. And we want to figure out what your particular HVAC system will do that's the least harmful. So there's this tool called the IPI dew point calculator, which is dpcalc.org. It's free, it's a little web-based tool, it's pretty great. And you just go there, you input your temperature and relative humidity. Dew point is a way to look at the total amount of water in the air. But for your purposes, what is fantastic about this tool is over on this side. You put in your temperature and relative humidity, and it will tell you what that's doing to your collection. So at 68 degrees, 50% relative humidity, we're at risk for natural aging, that's that hydrolysis chemical reactions. We're not at much risk for mechanical damage, which is the expansion and contraction. We're not going to get mold, yay! And we're okay for metal corrosion. So you can take what's happening in your space and tweak those numbers and see what you can make happen using your system. And it's very difficult to get everything out of the risk, but you can, play around with it. Doing this, of course, presumes that you know what's going on in your collection in terms of temperature and relative humidity. And you may not know at this point anything. My recommendation is putting together an environmental monitoring program. And when I do preservation assessments for people, if they don't already have a monitoring program in place, the first thing I tell them is that they need to have a monitoring program. I do mine with data loggers. You can do them with actual thermometers, but then you have to do things like remember to write down your temperature and relative humidity a couple times a day. Chances are you don't have that kind of time in your life. So I use this data logger. There are fancier ones out there, but this one I like because it is cheap and it is easy to use. There is software that goes with it. The software is free. There on your references, you have leaflets from the Northeast Document Conservation Center, and they have a great leaflet about how to set up your environmental monitoring program. So I'm not going to spend our time doing that. But if you do an environmental monitoring program, it will tell you what is happening in your collection's temperature and relative humidity wise. And you can go through the course of a year and you can see what is happening, and you can try tweaking your system to see if you can make things better. All right, so far so good? Awesome. Then let's move on to light. Light's another thing that affects the longevity of collections because it speeds up the oxidation of paper. It will weaken and embrittle your cellulose fibers. It will bleach paper and inks, but it also causes yellowing. That's that whole lignin thing again. And all light exposure is damaging. I love this picture because it really shows off that bleaching. This book, that's kind of a weird salmon color now, at one point was as red as this. But it's in a house museum, and they have the cookbooks here, a window right there, and after 20 years of light exposure, that book is almost unreadable. It was pretty dramatic. Ultraviolet light is the most damaging for paper, and you get ultraviolet light primarily through sunlight and fluorescent light in library and archive situations. So windows, fluorescent bulbs over your collections. Yeah. And we say that light damage is cumulative and irreversible, which means that if you put something back into dark storage after exposing it to the light, all of those chemical reactions that were started continue on. You're still getting more acids formed. There's still water in the air. So how do we slow down light damage? Light damage is easier to control than temperature and relative humidity fluctuations, which is awesome. So the first thing you can do is keep things in light-tight enclosures, which another way of saying put it in a box. It's not always practical to put your entire collection in boxes. So I always like to see lights kept off in storage areas. And I tend to recommend to people that they install motion sensors for their storage areas. That way you don't have to remember to turn the lights off and train everyone to turn the lights off. They just go off. And it's not that expensive to do. Usually administrations will be on board with making it happen because they will see themselves saving money on their power bill down the road. So it's a nice bonus for them that your collections are safe. If you have windows and doors, you can cover them with either UV filtering film or light blocking blinds or drapes. And if you have blinds and drapes, that means you have to actually use them. I've seen many places that have blinds and drapes and don't ever actually put the blinds down. They're not doing you any good if they're up. And finally, if you are blessed or cursed with UV fluorescent fluorescent tubes over your storage, you can put filters on them that will filter out 97% of the ultraviolet radiation, which buys you a whole lot of safety. The tubes last for about 10 years. The trick is that the people who are changing your bulbs for you need to know what's going on with them so they don't think it's just a random piece of plastic and throw it away. But those tubes are a really good investment in your collection. And then, sure.
We have those, but we're only open generally about 4 months of the year in our display area. So do they deteriorate over 10 years even if they're not used that much? Or no matter how much lights are actually on?
I don't have a great answer for that, actually. If my web page has a contact form on it.
Okay.
If you get in touch with me, I will see if I can find somebody who has an answer. What I can tell you is that anecdotally, we're thinking that they may last even more than 10 years. As they get more and more, as the plastics get more and more cross-linked, they're even more effective at filtering out the UV light. So my inclination is to say, I don't know that you can get 40 or 30 years if you're only open a quarter of the time, but you probably are getting more than 10 years out of them anyhow. All right. So because it's right before lunch, I thought I would show you a picture of a disgusting bug. Pests and housekeeping are the last sort of phase of the preservation environment, and they are closely interrelated issues. That's because dust is full of food sources for insects. If you get insects in, they will draw more insects because they're little cannibals and will eat each other's corpses. And insects like to be in cool, dark areas. Where do we like to store our collections? Cool, dark areas, exactly. So we have to keep really on our game to try to make sure we have no insects. Typical insect damage is tunneling through paper, staining. They will leave behind their little bodily secretions. I hate insects. And superficial damages to surfaces, like the silverfish that we saw on the last slide. They like to just eat the top off of books and top off of paper. And we say that insect damage is quick and catastrophic. Right? All the brittleness That happens over the course of centuries, but this damage can happen over the course of a weekend. So and a paper conservator can fill all those little holes, but they're never going to be able to put that text back. So once the insect damage is done, it's irreversible. So we want to make sure it doesn't happen. And some of the things we can do to keep insects down. You want to know what kinds of insects are in your collections. Chances are there is a baseline amount of acceptable insect activity. Nobody has a perfectly insect-free environment. They are sneaky and will find their way in. So if you monitor with sticky traps, which you can either buy, or if you have a pest control company, they'll probably give them to you. You want to keep a list of what you're seeing. And that way, if you see your population of silverfish jump dramatically, you know you have a problem. Good housekeeping will keep pests out of your collections. It'll also keep your collections from getting stained and dirty and abraded from dust. So don't be the repository where you can write your name in the dust. That's not. Please don't be those people. You don't want any food or drink in collections areas, and plants also will draw pests. Even fake plants will draw pests. When was the last time you dusted your fake plants? Exactly. If you have trees and plants that touch your building, you want to trim them back. That's, first of all, they hold moisture to your building, so it'll raise your relative humidity, but also those provide pathways for insects to get into your building. They're like little bridges in. And next time you walk around your building, look at the windows and see what the seals are doing and if they're beginning to pull back from the windows, because that makes it easy for pests to get in. And I cannot tell you how many places I've gone that there's like 1/4 of an inch of daylight underneath the front door. 1/4 of an inch to you is nothing, but to an insect is like a gigantic gate just beckoning them inward. So check your weather stripping periodically as well. And finally, when people donate materials to you, chances are they have been stored in the attic, or the basement, or the garage, or the barn, none of which are known for being mold and pest-free atmospheres. So it's a really good idea to quarantine materials and inspect them thoroughly before you integrate them with your collections. So you can put things on a loading dock if you have one. If you are fancy and lucky, you might have a dedicated airtight quarantine room. Those are really cool. But what I do most of the time for small donations, because it's cheap and easy, is just take yourself to Target or Walmart or whoever you like to shop with and buy those Sterilite tubs that you use to put Christmas tree ornaments in the garage. The ones like, yeah. It's not perfectly airtight, but it's close enough, right? It's keeping pests out of your stuff in your garage. So that's what I use. It's cheap, it's easy. And usually quarantine for at least 3 days and inspect thoroughly. All right. Yeah.
What about freezing paper?
Freezing paper. If you have infestations, freezing is absolutely the way to handle it. And you put things in a freezer. If you Google it, you'll find the exact specifications, but you drop the temperature as quickly as you can. If you drop the temperature very slowly, the insects will think they are just going into hibernation for the winter. But if you drop it really quickly, you'll get them all. And then, so what I've always been taught is you warm it up very slowly, and then you freeze it again. And that way, if there's anything that did hibernate, you'll catch them on the second freeze. But just yesterday, I was talking with one of the textile conservators from NMAI, and she says that they don't do that second freeze anymore. So, yeah, but if you have an infestation of pests, the absolute best way to handle it in your collections is freezing them. Thank you. That was an excellent question.